It was the summer of 1997 when Jake and his friends discovered an old arcade on the outskirts of town. It wasn't like the shiny new arcades in the mall. This one looked run down, forgotten, and neglected. But something about its eerie, abandoned state pulled them in. The neon sign flickered weakly, and the door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the arcade was mostly dark, with only a few machines still functioning. Dust covered the floor, and the air was thick with a musty, stale smell. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, Jake and his friends were eager to try out the games. They each picked different machines, but Jake was drawn to one in particular. It was a game he'd never seen before, one with no name and a black, featureless screen. Curious, he inserted a coin, and the screen lit up with strange symbols. It was a racing game, but unlike any he had ever played. The graphics were hyper-realistic, showing dark roads and ominous landscapes. As Jake controlled his car, he noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles, no other racers. It was just him, driving down an endless, foggy highway. The game felt strangely personal, like it was designed just for him. As he played, the game's atmosphere grew darker and more intense. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the side of the road. It was a man, standing in the distance, staring directly at Jake's car. Jake swerved to avoid him, but the figure continued to appear at random intervals, closer each time. Jake's heart began to race as the game became more unnerving. The man's face, once obscured by the fog, became clearer with each encounter. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale, and his mouth twisted into a sinister smile. No matter how fast Jake drove, the man would always appear in front of him. Then, the game froze. The screen went black, and the man's face filled the entire screen, staring directly at Jake. Jake jumped back from the machine, his hands trembling. He looked around, but his friends were still playing, unaware of his growing fear. Suddenly, the machine powered down, and the lights in the arcade flickered. The entire room seemed to shift, growing darker and colder. Jake could feel something was wrong, deeply wrong. He backed away from the machine, but before he could leave, the screen flickered back on. The man's face reappeared, now grinning wider than before. But this time, the man spoke. "Leave," the voice hissed, "or you'll never make it home." Without another thought, Jake ran to his friends, urging them to leave the arcade. They followed him out, confused by his sudden panic. But as they stepped outside, the old neon sign flickered and went out. The arcade was swallowed by darkness, as if it had never been there. Jake never went back, and to this day, he swears that man in the game was real. The machine? Gone. The arcade? Vanished. But the memory of that face haunts him, and he's never set foot in an arcade again. Lisa and her brother Tim loved playing retro arcade games. They were collectors, always on the hunt for rare or forgotten titles. One evening, they found themselves at an old arcade that had been around since the 80s. It was a hidden gem, filled with games they had never seen before. Among the dozens of machines, one caught their attention. It was an old cabinet tucked away in the back, dusty and nearly forgotten. The game was called Void Runner, and neither of them had heard of it. The screen displayed a cryptic message, "Insert coin to play, if you dare." Tim, always up for a challenge, inserted a coin, and the game started with a blinding flash of light. The screen showed a simple maze, and Tim's task was to guide a small character through it. At first, the game seemed easy enough, but as he progressed, something strange began to happen. The walls of the maze started to shift, morphing into shapes that looked like faces. They were distorted, twisted, and seemed to be watching his every move. Lisa, watching over his shoulder, noticed that the faces looked eerily familiar. One of them looked like their childhood neighbor, who had passed away years ago. The game grew more unsettling with each level. Tim tried to quit, but the game wouldn't let him. The start button was unresponsive, and the screen flashed, "You must finish." Tim's hands shook as he continued to play, feeling trapped by the machine. Then, the faces started to whisper. At first, it was faint, but soon the voices grew louder. They called out names of people Lisa and Tim knew. Some were alive, others had long passed. The whispers became unbearable, filling the arcade with an eerie, otherworldly noise. Suddenly, the game took control of Tim's character. It raced through the maze at breakneck speed, heading straight toward a dead end. As it hit the wall, the screen flashed, "Game over, for now." Tim and Lisa stood there, frozen in fear. The whispers stopped, and the arcade fell silent once more. But as they turned to leave, the screen flickered back on, showing a final message. "We'll be waiting for your next visit." They never returned to that arcade, and they never spoke of Void Runner again. But sometimes, late at night, they can still hear those whispers, calling their names. Mark was a regular at his local arcade. He loved the thrill of playing games, winning tickets, and redeeming them for prizes. But his favorite game, by far, was the claw machine. He had a knack for it, always managing to win the best stuffed animals and toys. One night, Mark was at the arcade later than usual. The place was almost empty, and the lights were dimming as the closing time approached. He decided to take one last shot at the claw machine before heading home. As he positioned the claw over a large teddy bear, something strange happened. The machine's lights flickered, and the claw stopped moving midair. Mark tapped the buttons, but nothing worked. Frustrated, he stepped back, wondering if the machine had finally broken. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Mark saw something move inside the machine. It wasn't one of the toys shifting, it was something else, something dark. He leaned closer, peering through the glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. That's when he saw it, a face. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. A man's face, staring at him from within the pile of stuffed animals. Mark stumbled back in shock. The face was pale, with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. It looked old, like it had been trapped inside the machine for decades. For a moment, Mark thought he was imagining it, but then the face moved. The man behind the glass grinned wider, his mouth stretching unnaturally long. His eyes locked onto Mark's, and his lips moved, as if he were speaking. But no sound came from the machine. Only the soft hum of the arcade filled the air. Mark's heart pounded as he backed away from the machine, his mind racing. He glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice what he had seen. The arcade staff were busy closing up, oblivious to the terror unfolding in front of the claw machine. Without thinking, Mark turned and ran for the exit. As he reached the door, he risked one last glance back at the machine. The face was gone, replaced by the familiar pile of stuffed animals. But Mark knew what he had seen. He never returned to that arcade, and he never played a claw machine again. Sometimes, when he's out late at night, he catches a glimpse of that man's face in reflective surfaces, a reminder that some games should never be played. Some things are better left alone. Curiosity can lead you down dangerous paths, especially when dealing with the unknown. Beware of the unseen. Just because something looks innocent, like an arcade game or a claw machine, doesn't mean it can't hold something sinister. Heed the warnings. Sometimes, the warning signs are right in front of you. If something feels off or too eerie, it's best to walk away before it's too late. These stories remind us that even in places meant for fun and games, darkness can lurk, waiting for the right moment to strike.